Alright, everybody, welcome to another live cast here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel. We have another Perceptive podcast this week that we're going to be doing, and we have a special guest. My guest tonight is from Stellar Jockeys, the creator of Brigador, as well as Brigador Uparmored Edition. Please welcome Hugh Monahan.
Hello, very nice to be here. Thanks for having me on.
It
Good
seems like it's
veteran
been
of this podcast now.
seems like it's been a very long time since we last spoke.
Yeah, a lot happens since the first launch and following through with Brigador and just trying to carry as much momentum forward into future projects.
And for our stream or cast tonight, we're going to be discussing what happened with Brigador. For those of you who don't know what we're talking about, Brigador came out, I think that was that late 2016 or early 2017?
So the 1.0 launch was June 2016. We did early access. So the timeline is early access was October 2015. And then we did 1.0 June 2016, and then Uparmored was a year later, June 2017.
And what we're going to be talking about is how Brigador unfortunately didn't do well right out of the gate, and what led to you guys spending that extra year reworking the game and adjusting it with the Uparmored edition. And we're going to kind of talk about what happens when the launch doesn't go as planned tonight, which is always a happy and uplifting topic for everyone involved. For those of you who are longtime fans of Game Wisdom, we did something like this similar with Skyshine's Bedlam, which I think came out in, I want to say, late 2015, early 2016, who also unfortunately ran into an issue where they had to readjust things after launch. But I'm sure we'll all be happy and, happy and lovey-dovey by the end of our stream tonight. But let's get things going. I guess to begin with, for people who didn't listen to our previous cast or don't know what Brigador is, Hugh, could you talk a little bit about, I guess, what is the game in a nutshell?
Sure. Brigador is the technical term is an isometric tactical combat shooter, which is sort of a mouthful of marbles. It's a tank and mech game about blowing stuff up. You have custom vehicles and loadouts. It's just vehicle combat in an urban environment largely. And we took pains to make sure you had fully destructible environments. So it's a lot of that sort of rampage Kool-Aid Man fantasy writ large.
I think when we last spoke, I think there was some inspiration from like the old, what was it, Desert Strike or Jungle Strike, that kind of vehicle isometric game from, I think, what was that, like the Genesis or SNES era?
So what's funny is Desert Strike's probably the game that comes up the most for us whenever Brigador is mentioned. I may have kind of peripherally seen Desert Strike, but if I had, I'd forgotten it existed when we were working on Brigador. The major touchstone was actually Crusader No Remorse, and to a lesser extent Mech Commander. Because actually Brigador was originally more of an RTS style game, and then we switched to just direct control over a single unit. There were other games like Mech Warrior 3050, and there's a lot of sort of spiritual ancestors that for the most part we actually didn't know about, and so it's a fascinating thing for me to look back at these games and see how we were trying to solve a lot of the same problems, but with different resources at hand, but also to see how we went about solving those in some ways using the same solutions, in some ways doing very, very different solutions to those issues. And so, yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of games that are similar, but for whatever reason, I just didn't know about a lot of them. So for a lot of it, we were basically designing in a vacuum. And I think that's one of the reasons why Brigador kind of is its own odd duck of a game.
And I think one of the more interesting aspects of Brigador that I know we talked about last time on our cast was the extensive backstory and lore you guys put into the game. For those of you who don't know, there's an entire sci-fi novel, I think, written about the backstory of Brigador.
Yes, fine work of Brad Buckmaster. He's a friend of ours who we originally brought on as kind of a authenticity consultant, for lack of a better term. He did 2 tours. He's an experienced infantryman, and so we leveraged his expertise to kind of help build a lived-in, real feeling world. And then he was doing such a good job that eventually turned into just running a whole book within the game's universe, and that's something I couldn't be prouder of. And we're continuing to work with him and with a lot of these other guys that we kind of brought in to help build and expand the Brigador universe.
Mm-hmm. The amount of lore in the game is certainly fascinating. I know for those of you who play the game, you know that there's just so many little lore pieces that you have in there to try and bring this world to life.
Yeah, for context, if you remember, the original Mass Effect had this huge codex, which was one point of inspiration. I thought it was beautifully written. And there's also an artist by the name of Keith Thompson, who I actually have the good fortune to sort of be an acquaintance of. We've chatted several times, but he's a phenomenal artist who if anyone's familiar with his work, it's probably most likely to be from his work on the Alien. It's the third-person shooter that's Warframe. So he did a lot of the character concepts, the armor concepts for Warframe. So lots of people familiar with his stuff. But if you go to his personal site, he does. So he's an artist, and he does these magnificent pieces. But then he also does these little bios next to them, just 1 or 2 paragraphs. And it's a small little sort of flavor text, but it provides such a massive amount of contextualization and brings so much more flavor to each individual piece, that between that and what the writers did with Mass Effect, that was something that we wanted to try and carry into Brigador. Anyway, we did. From a volume standpoint, Brigador has about just over 40,000 words in it. Most of that is in those sort of lore nuggets, which is the equivalent of like a 120-page paperback. So we didn't really. It was probably too much, actually.
Let's see, a comment from Chat Electric Twanger, sorry about that, said Brigador is the most important game of our generation.
That's maybe being a little overly kind, but I appreciate the sentiment.
And I think you're right about that, Hugh, in terms of just a little bit of description about these abilities or these characters. It just really adds a lot to the world and the lore around it. I remember the first game I played that did that was like StarCraft way back in the day, and the manual, of course, had descriptions for every character. Every tech in the game had some in-lore reason why it exists.
Yeah, and that was, so my brother Jack Monahan and I, the world of Brigador actually predates working on the project at all. He was working on a project called Animal Memory several years prior to when I had started the Brigador side of things. Originally, we were working on 2 separate things, and that the original sort of 80s vision of the future. So like science fiction, but without miniaturization, big chunky computers and kind of more advanced but less advanced in very specific ways. A lot of that came from him. And so we had kind of a broad understanding of what the world was. But once we had that, building Brigador, rather than do this sort of designed by fiat of just like, okay, well, here's the world and then here's the story, and like go from the top down. Once we had a general idea of what that world was and kind of a logic to it, then we went down to the very granular level and we wanted to see what is it like, what are these people like in this world, and we focused very much on this very close in view in order to uh, give the player and give the reader a context that felt like a place that could believably exist, rather than this sort of massive fantasy sci-fi lore tome that you just get handed down. We wanted more anecdotal stories and just that feeling of it being a real place.
Mm-hmm. Another major part of Brigador definitely has to be the soundtrack and like that 80s synth wave that everyone loved. For the people watching, who did the music for Brigador?
So it's a band called Makeup and Vanity Set. So the music is done by a guy named Matt Pusti, who's a wonderful, wonderful both musician and just person in general. I had that's probably the greatest stroke of luck for us. Was he was a friend of a guy I met at GDC who also ended up becoming a good friend. And we were just desperately flailing to find someone who could do that John Carpenter-esque, just dark, heavy synth. And as soon as I mentioned that, my friend Davis just goes, "You can stop looking." And he introduced me to Matt, and Matt did a demo track and just blew us away. And it was just an effortless collaboration. And originally we were supposed to, original contract with him was for 1 hour of music, and his stuff was so good, and we just loved working with him, that by the time we finished Uparmored, we ended up doing 3.5 hours of music with him. So if that's any indication.
Nice. Now, here's a question I have about the original design, Hugh. For those of you who haven't played Brigador, there's two main modes of content in the game. You have a single-player campaign, and you have kind of like this non-linear like sandbox, where you basically just create a mission, you choose a Brigador, you choose a pilot, and then you go nuts, basically. With the original vision for the game, what was kind of the primary I guess gameplay mode that you guys originally envisioned for the game?
The freelance. So this what is now the sort of secondary game mode, and that was one of the fruits of early access. We originally built the game to be procedural is the wrong word, because almost all of the content was authored in some way. The only procedural component was really some randomization in the maps and in the enemy structure. But Brigador was originally designed almost more as an arena style game, because we'd spent years building the engine and building the game mechanics, and that was just how we saw that game, as just sort of a pure mechanical experience. We still had this wealth of lore and kind of implicit storytelling, but no overt narrative. Part of that was limitations of an engine that we built. Scripting can be a tremendous pain to do, but also that was just what, at the time, that was our vision for the game, was just cool loadouts, getting new equipment. You choose how difficult of a fight you want to get yourself into, and just kind of rinse and repeat. It's something that a game that I admire very much is called Devil Daggers. It's a very pure game, wonderfully executed, and there's no fat. It's just you get in, you have just the few tools. There's anyone who's played the game knows what I'm talking about. And that was more akin to our original vision and we were just adding kind of all this lore on top because we sort of couldn't really help ourselves. And then when we launched on early access, what we realized, the almost unanimous response to the game was that this is a really cool tech demo. And we're like, well, what are you talking about? So people were like, well, where's the story? Where's the campaign? And our, we launched October, and our intent was to be out of early access by like January, February. And we were just sitting there dumbstruck, just like, oh, so, we just went back to the drawing board a little bit, and just thought, okay, how can we pivot? How can we, without blowing the rest of our money and going way too over time budget, how can we fulfill this demand? Because and a lot of that was sort of predicated on just a gross misunderstanding of what the average player wants out of a game. And we had been designing Brigador as more of a purist experience for very hardcore players, and which is fine, and I'm very proud of that community that we have and of the guys who have put in hundreds of hours into the game. But at the same time, we weren't doing a good job of introing people into the game, of giving players a way in. And that's largely what things like campaigns are for, is you get a catered experience. And for those who aren't necessarily as mechanically oriented, or those who aren't as interested in a pure agonistic experience, and people who don't play games for the challenge, who play games for the story or for the kind of the satisfaction of completion, that's what you need things like campaigns for, where it's a very explicit, here's your goal, it's a very, very bite-sized chunk of time, and once you have done it, it is a discrete completion, right? Whereas a game that's built around kind of skirmishing or repeat play, you're never technically done. And I think that is a difficult thing for a lot of players. So anyway, long story short is that we got that feedback during early access. We went, oh shit, and we dramatically expanded our early access development period and just crammed in as much of a campaign as we possibly could before the 1.0 launch in June of 2016. And there were plenty of problems when that 1.0 launch hit, but we're very lucky to be developing during the digital age, and that if you blow your ship date because we're only digital distribution, you can just keep discreetly patching, slip those updates in at 2 a.m. and then no one's the wiser.
Yeah, it's very interesting about that kind of perception of where the bulk of your game is supposed to be. Like, we see this in like larger titles with the whole I guess the fine line between single and multiplayer based content. Where a game is multiplayer, developers may throw in like a little single player campaign kind of to, again, get your foot in the door, but then you're supposed to spend the whole time multiplayer. And it sometimes can be very tricky to figure out just what someone is expecting when they buy your game. Like, where is the focus of that experience supposed to be?
Right, and there's no real simple answer for that. Part of that is just the player, how you as a developer present your game to the player. Expectation is so much of how someone goes into a game and how they experience it. That's one of the challenges of being a first-time developer. We were a new studio and new developers, so there's no reputation that any of us really had going into this. My brother being the one exception. But for the most part, we were a blank slate, and so all anyone had to go on were our trailers and just sort of the initial presentation of the game. And we frankly just did a poor job of telegraphing what that game was about. Partly, I think, just because we didn't properly understand ourselves. and just our inexperience as developers. And I peep most of that on myself just because I was one handling kind of business and marketing end of things. But um, people tend to respond to what you give them based on how you've primed them. So if you tell someone in explicit ways before they start playing a game that, hey, this is a game where you're going to die a lot, it's a challenging game, um, be ready for this, then they're going, if they do start dying a lot and have that kind of experience, even if that's not necessarily their cup of tea, they're going to find that far more amenable than if they just go in cold, start playing that game, or even worse, if they have the expectation of the opposite,
Yeah.
And then just start getting annihilated. And it can go the other way as well. So any subversion of that expectation, sometimes you can use that to good effect, but largely that can be problematic, especially in the first hour or two of playing a game. And on top of that, that was just another aspect of being a new developer is we didn't understand what the distribution curve was for players and like kind of desired gameplay experience. What I mean by that is, I was talking a long time ago with the developers of Galaxy, and this is an extreme case, but they had better stat tracking than us, so they were able to give me more concrete data points than we were able to give ourselves. But 92% of their player base never made it out of the first dungeon. So basically never played more than an hour or two. Which means that basically the people who fund your game are making, are only playing a very small fraction of what you present to them. Now that, those statistics aren't universal. For story-driven games or, narrative-type games, that distribution is much, much different. But for mechanically heavy games, you see a much more severe curve. And what we inadvertently did was, the game got really hit its stride between mechanical mastery and the unique control scheme. The game didn't really hit its stride until an hour or two in, which meant that we were ostracizing roughly 80-90% of our potential player base right off the bat, and most of them were quitting playing the game before they ever got to the point where the game really resonated or could have.
Yeah, and that is always one of the hardest things, especially for indie games that go for a very unique feel and touch to their titles, but it takes a lot more to get into them. And as you said a few minutes ago, Hugh, with something like Galaxy or titles where it's very hard to communicate what the actual meat or what the actual experience of the game is, someone can go into it thinking, I'm just dying, I'm horrible at it, so this game must be bad, without properly understanding it. A classic example, of course, is the debates of games like Dark Souls and Cuphead, where those are games that you're expected to die. You are expected to see the "you suck" screen over and over again. But if someone goes into those games sight unseen, they're going to be in for a horrible time. And when you add into the fact that you're giving the player something that isn't really easy to digest or really isn't easy to explain to them, it can make it all the more confusing. I know some other examples would be something like, what was it? Duskers by Tim Keenan, if you heard of that game.
Mm-hmm. I went to his talk at GDC, actually. He's a very good speaker.
Mm-hmm. Or one of my favorite games, Renowned Explorers by Abbey Games. Those are two games where, it's very hard to explain to someone in 10 seconds just what exactly you're doing in those titles. And it becomes very difficult to properly advertise, the core gameplay loop in those cases.
Yeah, and that's when I talk to other developers, especially new guys coming in, that's one of the biggest caveats I give, which is that the more you divert from an established from established forms, the harder you have to work
Mm-hmm.
to get people to buy in. And
Mm-hmm.
that's not to say that you shouldn't innovate, um, but doing something new inevitably is going to cost more time and more money because you're exploring the unknown. You have fewer points of departure, fewer anchors to draw from, um, and it also means that from a player expectation, you know, most video games actually are an iteration on a form in fairly subtle ways.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad thing. And in fact, it's a very helpful thing because you have players coming into a game with a body of knowledge that carries over. Um, so like if you've played any RPGs before, like if you've played Baldur's Gate or Pillars of Eternity, and then you go in and play Divinity, well, yes, those are different games, but a lot of the understanding of what's important, of how stat screen work, all of these other expectations largely have a through line, and so the learning curve is much softer, and also it's just a much more approachable experience. And so the more you divert from that, um, I guess the easiest way to put it is just that if um, the more different you are from an established form, the harder and longer it takes for a new player to find the fun there. If they are an experienced gamer, if they are someone who has played previous games, who has some kind of point of knowledge, and so it's just something you have to consider. And we were very conscious when we were working on Brigador that we wanted to make something that was different, and I think we did that, and I'm proud of what we made. But in my sort of naivete and just a combination of lack of experience, but also because all of our efforts were just going towards the mechanical implementation of the game, I never made it around to understanding the social context of that and the importance of priming players on how to play the game and what to expect before they even buy it. Mm-hmm. And so if you're having to prime players at the intro screen, to an extent, you're already kind of too late, because there's going to be an expectation, unless you like release your game out of the blue. There's going to be an expectation based on how press have talked about it, any kind of buzz or trailers, the media cycle. There's going to be an expectation about what your game is like, what's it's going to be about, and that is going to inform how players approach it. So anyway, that's
yeah, and it's always challenging, as you said, regarding that kind of appeal or trying to get someone into these games. Oh, hey Sergey, welcome back to the stream.
Guys,
what you said a few seconds ago regarding how games are iterated on or quote unquote borrow from other titles. I mean, you can, if you understand game design, you can almost play that 6 Degrees of Separation or 6 Degrees from Kevin Bacon game with just about any video game you can imagine. And it's a very easy way to get someone who's an experienced gamer to try these games. I mean, how many times have we heard someone say, "Oh, this game is just like so and so, but with that"? But conversely, one of the biggest challenges, though, is when you're trying to appeal to new players that way. You mentioned, of course, the RPG genre. One of my favorite examples is like the grand strategy genre, your Europa Universalis, Stellaris, and so on. For people who are experienced with those games, they know them, they can get into them very easily. But if you've never played them or you have trouble, it basically like the whole genre is already predisposed to those experts without really having that appeal for new players. And it can be very hard for someone brand new to jump into those games without having that prior experience.
Right. And I think with the 4X genre, especially, that I think that's a genre as a whole where there is an implicit understanding that's going to be mechanically obtuse. Uh, it's just the nature of having a very systems complex game. And I think that's kind of a double-edged sword because it means that players familiar with the genre are going to give you a lot more leeway because they expect it to take a couple hours to really grok the game that you have, and so you have that larger runway. But at the same time, it means that if you're designing for that and doing something very systems heavy, that is all that much more intimidating and more difficult for someone who is entirely new to that genre.
Mm-hmm.
But we got some questions here. Also, real quick, Twanger, I'm getting too old for this Devil Dagger stuff. He's working on it. Hi, Sergey. And yeah, Oscar. So you asked, how was the reception on the updated version? The short answer is great. It was far better. I mean, we basically had a year of filling out content and of polishing the game. The tutorial that launched with Uparmored was I think our fourth revision, like complete revision of the tutorials. And we just realized this was kind of a change of mindset on my part, that you want complexity and depth to be opt-in, not opt-out. And the reason for that simply being that that it is that the opt-in, the higher complexity, more fine-tuned controls and that kind of nuanced input, that is something that generally is of a niche audience interest. And by making, so originally Brigador shipped with only the tank style control scheme, and we had a rudimentary version of the twin stick style implemented actually even before early access, and I made the conscious decision to remove it because in my mind, if players had the choice between the correct control scheme, the one that gives you the best control, and the control scheme that the game was designed around, and versus an inferior one, I didn't want to trap players with learning a control scheme that made high-end play more difficult than having that fine control scheme. But that was entirely a false dichotomy, because in reality, the vast majority of players are never playing enough to get to a high enough skill threshold where which input scheme you used really mattered. And second of all, because the learning curve was so much higher for tank controls, it would just be totally different, by the way, if we released Brigador in the 90s. Because tank controls were far more common then, so that would have been a standard expectation. But now it's a very unusual control scheme. And so in my head, it was, okay, well, they'll just learn the new control scheme, when in reality, it just means that people would try it and they would just bounce off and return the game. So the third option that I didn't consider was that they would just uninstall. And at the end of the day, it just comes down to, we want people to play our games and to enjoy them. And, how you do that doesn't really matter as much. So I softened up a lot on I had a very hard line approach to a lot of these things, and just getting more direct contact with a broader variety of players, and also just having the experience of launching the games kind of changed how I looked at that.
Mm-hmm. And I know when we last spoke about Brigador last year, I think it was either last year or in 2016. Again, it feels hard to tell when we last did it. One of the things that you talked about again was what the original vision for Brigador was, with that very specific tank-like control scheme. And as you said, it's very tricky to understand the player's mindset when it comes to these games, because I am sure whether they're watching this live record right now, there are hardcore fans of Brigador who have probably mastered that tank-like control scheme, and they have played the game, into the very ground with them.
Oh yeah.
And it's always tricky to figure out just what exactly the feel is your game. Like, to give you an example, with Cuphead, whatever the control scheme the developers originally put into that, I know for myself and a lot of people, we immediately, completely remapped the whole control scheme to make it easier to play. And it's very hard. I did a two-part video series about control schemes and UI design. And when you start getting to very intricate or very unique control schemes, it becomes a much harder sell for the general consumer. As you said, for the hardcore people, like, I guess going back to what we said a few minutes ago regarding the perception of the game, if someone's going into your game expecting a very intricate control scheme, they'll probably spend that time to learn it. But for everyone else, they're going to pick up the game, mess around with the controls for a few seconds, and go, "Oh my god, I can't figure this out." Uninstall, refund.
Right. And that's where you look at a game like Getting Over It with Benedict's Body.
Oh yeah.
And that's just, it's a perfect example of when you properly prime your audience, they'll go to the moon with you, and that's something I really appreciate about what he did with that game. And obviously that's a long pedigree of learning how to do that with QWOP and the rest of his games. But it shows you that it is possible to bring people along, but you have to build the game and build the presentation in very specific ways that telegraph that to people. And also, and it's not just presentation, it's the mechanical implementation as well. I mean, that, Getting Over It at its core level is literally a game about learning the controls, essentially. And so that game would be completely different if you were trying to navigate that same path and also having to dodge arrows or something in a shmup style or whatever, and then, like, you were dying and getting your progress reset on top of it. Like, that would have been so antithetical to what makes that game what it is. And he clearly understood that and built this very specific scenario around that game. And even it goes to show with his monologues as you play along, and that kind of soft chiding but also encouragement that goes with it.
Mm-hmm. And with Getting Over, I mean, there's a whole discussion we had about whether or not that is a good game or a bad one. Because I've had people discuss that if you're having trouble control schemes, it doesn't matter how niche or unique they are, it's just a frustrating experience. And I've had other people say that when the developer explicitly designed it that way, then it's a different feeling compared to if the developer just, threw it all together and just didn't even bother trying to play test it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a case where intentionality has a lot to do with it. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, something that he's very good about is that there's not really anything unnecessary in that game. It's a very it is a mechanically simple game. Like, the number of things you can do is very small, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, and I don't mean that to dismiss it either. It is a very specific, and very honed thing, and arguments that it's a bad game because it's difficult or there's a lot to learn. Those arguments don't have any truck with me, just because that is what the game gives you. I mean, it is literally a game about overcoming frustration and the difficulties of these controls, and of kind of a battle of will uh, with yourself. Um, and given that context and that presentation, I think that the game does it with aplomb. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's just a very clever thing.
Mm-hmm. And going back to what you said about Devil Daggers, I would also say that Game Over is a very lean experience like that. It's a game that it has everything that it wants and no, extra baggage or
Yes.
fat in the experience.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean that's a good. I think they're both, even though the gameplay is extraordinarily different. I think they're very similar in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Now, we kind of moved, thanks to Elgordo or Oscar, into talking about Up Armored, but before we get to that, if anyone has any questions for Hugh regarding the general play or general design of Brigador, please mention that now or put that in the chat, because we'll move on to Up Armored probably in like the next 2 or 3 minutes. Sergey just asked, are you working on any new projects right now, Hugh?
Yes, but I'm not going to say anything more right now.
All right. Of course, you gotta leave the people with a little tease there.
Yeah, there are new things in the pipe, and we've got one more update for Brigador, but then we're adding Chinese and Italian, and a few other like balance things and other sprinklings, but we've largely moved on to the next thing.
Mm-hmm. I guess I have two more general questions for you about Brigador, Hugh, and then we'll probably spend the bulk of our time talking about Up Armored itself, and then whatever the chat decides to bring up. For those of you watching this live right now, we're going to shoot for about like an hour and a half in terms of the total stream. We may go a little bit over if there's enough interest, but yeah, we're not going to be here for like the next 2.5, 3 hours talking about this. Let's see. Why you change the system, being able to independently select torsos and legs. I think is are you Hamoflavin? Are you talking about the Up Armor, the change in the the twin stick control scheme change? Because if you are, that's what we'll be focusing more on in a few minutes.
Yeah, I'm not sure because from a control standpoint. It was originally based around having independent control of both lower and upper, the twin stick style movement, because of basically if you don't have 0-point turning, well, I guess not just 0-point, but instantaneous 0-point turning. So if you look at a game like Geometry Wars, there's no acceleration. You immediately move in the direction and at the speed that you're pointing with the stick. With Brigador, we have accelerations and sometimes very slow accelerations, and turn speeds and everything else, which meant that for a twin stick style control scheme to work, we actually had to do some pathing AI interpretation of the input controls, and that's what made it difficult.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah. Okay. So in that regard, oh boy, that's really old stuff. So in the very early development, the origin was more this idea of piecemeal building a vehicle, a la like headgear. And the issue with that was partly just that the restrictions of animation meant that, tank treads and tank lowers are very easy to animate because we just had a programmatic vertical rumble, and then the only animating component are tank treads spinning. And that's, from a memory standpoint, it's very small. Mech legs, on the other hand, you had a walk animation, you had a crouch animation, you had a stomp animation, and in order to have really fluid animations at the zoom level that we had, we found that we needed 64 rotations. Or, if the object is symmetrical, which many of our designs weren't, sorry, if they were symmetrical, you needed 32. If they weren't, you needed 64. Um, and what we found was just that we had to limit the options on the lowers, uh, especially with leg units, in order to make it so that we could fit within. We set a hard 2 GB memory budget for Brigador, because we wanted to make sure we had a broad variety of hardware that could play the game. But also, what we just realized was that the real meat of the customization came from the vehicle as a whole, and then the weapons that you put on it. So, and in practicality, there are so many different vehicles to choose from. It's pretty close to just being able to choose the lower and the upper independently. And from a design standpoint, and also just the way we were handling the lore and these story nuggets and things, it was easier, and it was a better fit for us to articulate that as explicit vehicles with their own backgrounds and things than as subcomponents that get assembled together. And that's just, I mean, I think you could still make a good Brigador with that full granular customization, but we just didn't do that this time.
Mm-hmm.
Hope that answers your question.
And going back to the thought you were just on here regarding the turning and the acceleration, or like more of the tank-like controls, I describe games like that, like it feels like your character has heft to it, or there's weight to the movement, and it's very tricky, I find, to get that to feel right in the player's hands. Like, as you said, with something like Geometry Wars, you push up, your ship immediately goes up. There's no stopping. There's no getting up to full speed. And for a lot of people who like that kind of arcade-style controls, it just becomes very intuitive for them. But when you're playing a game, I'm trying to think of some other examples, and maybe the chat can bring this up as well. Other games that really give you that sense of heft or weight with your character's movement, there's a very fine line between having like a sense of place and just feeling like a very cumbersome experience. Maybe even something like I Am Bread or Surgery Simulator, where like you really get that sense that moving this character or moving your hand, it's part of the ordeal rather than just being a one-to-one experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was, so it's kind of a challenge from the view that we had. I mean, it's a fairly zoomed out camera, and the isometric perspective made it so that, we didn't have a cockpit that we could rely on, or like a close over the shoulder camera to help put the player into the vehicle that they were piloting. And so a lot of that had to come from the sound design, from the actual impact of the controls with the vehicle. And that was something we, the Toro, the original vehicle that we designed for the game, for a long time we only had like 5 or 6 vehicles, and I probably redid the speed and accelerations and everything, just the overall feel of that vehicle. I probably redid that about 100 times over the course of the game's development. And then once that finally really felt right, that was our anchor point. And from that, then, that was the measuring stick, and then everything else was, okay, how is this a thing in relation to that first thing? And because that's one of the hardest problems with game design is, you're essentially solving a complex equation with dozens of different variables. And what you have to do is lock in as early as possible. You have to lock in as many of those variables as you can in order to make it so that it's a solvable equation. Because otherwise, everything's floating, everything's changing. And rather than solve the problem, you just kind of, spin your wheels, and you're chasing your own tail. So that's a, I don't know. I love game design. I just, with the engine that we have, and even just without changing anything else besides game data, there's a dozen different games we could make with, there's different things that Brigador could have been. Given infinite time, I would love to make all of those. And that's one of the reasons why I'm a little frustrated, or actually more than a little frustrated, that we weren't better able to build the engine to allow for modding and these other things. It was, long story short, is that a decision that I, at the time, didn't fully understand the ramifications of, made it so that we dramatically improved the load time, so the load time within the game and the build speed of the game from a back end server side dramatically improved those, but the cost was that it essentially locked down the game data and made it much harder to unpack and to modify these things, and it essentially locked out any meaningful modding community. Same with doing like custom apps and everything else, and that's something that I'm always going to be kind of unhappy about. And I would hope to address at some point. It's just the financial realities of running a company in game development just make it so that you have to stick to money giving projects. And it's not that modding isn't worthwhile or that it can't generate interest in sales, but that's a much more it's a much bigger question mark. And especially with a game that's already basically 2 years old, 2.5 years old. Just kind of crazy to think about. But yeah, it just, you get to the point of diminishing returns. And so it's my hope that we are going to better enable that stuff in future projects, future projects in which it would make sense. But who knows? Receiver's great, by the way. So Aubrey Serre, who did a lot of design, who basically built most of Receiver, he's a former coworker of my brother's. They worked on Darkest of Days together, and we also brought him on to work on do some level design on Brigador, and he's a close friend. So that's something I was actually very happy of. To have his involvement in the game, and Receiver is a game that comes up often in conversation.
And going back very quickly, I'll get to your question in a second, Sergey. Going back to what you said a few minutes ago regarding the tank controls, and again that very fine line. I think another big example that just came to my mind, definitely don't want to compare to Brigador, would be like the survival horror genre. And they having very explicitly tank-like controls. And that, ooh, my mouth is dying on me. In that genre, explicitly designed to simulate, you're controlling a civilian or someone who's not combat heavy. And there are people who find the pros and cons of that. And again, there's always that line that you have to worry about between, are these controllers unique or explicit enough to create a unique experience? Or am I just, frustrating the player, like designing a car where like the steering wheel is under the seat and you have a rear view mirror up top, right, and just some crazy contraption.
So that's that's one of the reasons, I already said this, but it's one of the reasons why I love game design, because the the tools you give to the player inform the experience itself. Yes. Like, technically, you could play Steel Battalion. You could have made that game so it's playable on a mouse and keyboard or on a simple controller. Mm-hmm. But like, the controller itself was such an integral part of the game and the experience of that game. I love it to this day. I had a copy I had the whole thing for years, and I finally, kind of it was a casualty of moving apartments. I needed to kind of scale back the volume of stuff that I had. Still kind of regret it actually that I sold it, but um, it's it's something I'm fascinated by, and kind of with what's happening right now with VR. That's a continuing thing. I have an Oculus headset. Briefly at one point looking into VR development. Still interested in it, but it just right now is not the right time for us. But looking at a lot of this stuff, and that's VR right now it's still an open book, but it is redefining. It's providing a new perspective for what a game is and how you can experience. And that so with a case like the original Resident Evil with the tank controls, it is awkward to play, especially going back now. Um, the question is intent, and what is the thing you want to emphasize, because that was the kind of the wonderful horror of that game was in each new room getting your bearing and being able to it was very difficult to just even draw your weapon on a target, and it was panic inducing, and that kind of slow dread of having this zombie coming towards you, knowing you've only got 3 bullets left, and you're having trouble even aiming at the damn thing, and it's 5 feet away. That all those things, even though on their surface you could have made a quote better control scheme that better allowed you to interact within that environment, I think that would have made it a worse game, because it is that would have been dissonant with the intent of the game itself, and you would lose an element of that horror and of that experience. And else, just real quick, no, unless some things change, we're almost certainly not going to bring Brigador to console, mainly because since we wrote our own engine, that is a much harder thing to port. So if we had made Brigador in Unity or Unreal, there's porting houses who just with the experience that they can build up porting game after game in those engines to different consoles, it's something you can do much more readily. Whereas for us to do that with Brigador, that we don't have the technical expertise to do it in house anymore. The original programmers on the team have amicably moved on to different projects and different companies, but bringing in a porting house to do it, there's additional expenses. So just like the financial reality of it is that it would just be very expensive for us to do it. We might possibly recoup on that. Again, the longer after release, the kind of harder it becomes for a game to be profitable when you port. But also the other thing is just that while we do technically have controller support for the game, I just I don't think it's. I personally am uncomfortable with bringing the game to a console when the controller is the only input mechanism available. There's plenty of people who enjoy Brigador a lot on controller. I don't feel confident enough in that control scheme. The game wasn't built for a controller style control scheme, and there's just a lot of. We did the best we could with adding controller support to it, and it largely works, but there's inconsistencies and there's just difficulties with it. And so I both from a sales and like financial reality standpoint, but also just purely from a design standpoint, like I wouldn't want to release Brigador on console without doing some substantial redesign on some of the systems and or at least even just some of the data to make it so that it's a better fit to the console. And right now, I would rather spend that effort on making a new game that is maybe more amenable to porting than on just continuing working on Brigador.
Yeah, and that actually is going to take me to a question when we start talking more about up armored in the next minute or so. Homoflavian also asks, do you regret the decision to write your own engine from scratch? I know it's always a fun question to answer.
So it's kind of a moot question for us because I basically made a kind of devil's bargain. So first of all, 2010, 2011 was very different from right now. I mean, technically there were third-party engines, but Unreal at the time, so this is Unreal Engine 3. It was too expensive. Like I think there was an upfront licensing fee, and then on top of that, you were also losing like 20 or 30% revenue. It was heinous. Like you unless we had backing and were like financial backing and were very confident in the game we were making, it just wasn't a meaningful option. And Unity at the time was still so nascent. It just didn't have the level of it didn't have the functions, and also didn't allow us the level of control that we wanted for, especially if you're doing something experimental. You need to be able to control those variables, and there were no promises that we would have that with Unity. But the other thing on top of that is just that. So with Dale and Harry, the two programmers, I met those guys. I was fresh out of university, and they were finishing their degrees in computer science. But essentially, the deal that we made was that in exchange for them turning down very lucrative jobs that probably would have been far healthier, we would work together. I would handle, like they wouldn't have to touch stuff that's not programming, so they, wouldn't have to do any marketing or any of that kind of non-game related BS. But specifically, it was that they would get the chance to make their own engine, because from a programming standpoint, that's just, when you're starting out, no one's going to hire you to build an engine, even though that's an experience that as a programmer is extraordinarily valuable, because that's going to give you insights into so many things, at least if you're interested in working on a more low level programming end, which they both were. So I mean, there wasn't really a choice in the matter. That was just that was the best way for us all to work together, and for us all to kind of be happy with what we were working on. They were less interested. I mean, like, they did a lot. They had a big influence on the design side, even though we didn't really see eye to eye on a lot of what the game would be and how it should evolve. But they basically made the same decision that I did, just went about it a different way. I mean, I started Stellar Jockeys partly because I was terrified at the kind of churn and burn that's happening in a lot of studios, but also because I didn't want to start out as like a game tester, or and do a bunch of low level design and like have to wait 5 or 10 years before I got to run a project. No one hires a new guy as a lead designer, for very obvious and very good reasons. But in my kind of in my some combination of vanity and impatience, that's one of the main reasons why I started my own company, so that I could just exert that level of control from the beginning and be learning all of these things as a designer, that I could then, by the time that I'm 30 now, but I was 21 at the time, so by the time I was 30 and then eventually 40, I could be much further ahead than I would be if I was slowly working my way up the ranks. Anyway, so we had different kind of similar goals, just went about it in different ways, and that was very complementary for us, and that was how we ended up working together. but again, sorry for the very long-winded way of saying that we made our own engine because weren't really good options for what we wanted to do, and also at the time, when we started, it was 2 programmers and then 1 designer, so it made sense to do something programming heavy.
All right. I know, very. We can easily spend a lot of time on these questions. And go back to what you were saying earlier regarding game design. I mean, I love talking about it as well. It feels like we just started our chat and we're already over an hour into our talk today. Let's see. Sergey asked, gave you kind of like a rapid fire series of questions there. If you want to answer them really fast, and then we'll move on, and we'll talk more about Up Armor then, because I know we're starting to get a little bit late.
Yeah. And like hour and a half doesn't have to be a hard cutoff, but knew Aubrey through. We knew him before Receiver, but after Receiver was when he and I kind of reconnected, properly connected for the first time. I don't know what the Steam Direct question is. Don't regret the decision to write the engine from scratch. And yes, it was before Unity Unreal were really indie. And what prompted us to make this game? Brigador was the 7th iteration, like 7th game idea iteration from when we started the company. So there was a lot of things that we could have made. And our one of the earlier ones that we worked on, the very first game we made was actually called Stellar Jockeys, and it was basically a bad Star Control ripoff. There's a top-down custom, like you picked your roster of ships and you fought each other. And it was tremendously basic. I don't know if we even have footage posted of it anywhere. And then we were working on a top-down, like pixel art, single-screen brawler. It's like a local co-op brawler. And we worked on that for several months. This would have been like late 2010, early 2011. And then we realized all of us hated brawlers. So it's just like, why are we doing this? And then because we were writing our engine, we got into this sort of weird feedback loop where, I'd be designing a game for what the capabilities of the engine were at the time. And then, or it would, so either I would be designing for the engine, and then we realized that just it wasn't ambitious enough, or it just wasn't something after a while that we wanted to build, or I would design something that was too ambitious and exceeded the capabilities of the engine. And so there was this sort of lag time between what we were trying to build and then what the engine could actually support. And so we were just rubber banding a lot. And in the process, we would end up pivoting to a different idea that might better be able to capitalize on what was already built, but then that would morph. So 7 iterations, we went from pixel art brawler into dark dystopian mech combat in a sci-fi universe. I don't know. I don't think I can properly articulate that path. I just know it was sort of we meandered along all kinds of different influences. As far as what games I was playing, the biggest single influence wasn't necessarily a stylistic thing. It was just that we wanted to make a game that wasn't a one and done. And by that I mean we wanted to make a game that was sufficiently systems driven such that you could come back to it, and even if you were infinitely familiar with the game, you could still have a fun and even novel experience. So like a game like that for me personally is the original XCOM. That it's easily top 4 games of all time for me. I love the new XCOMs, so it's not poo-pooing Firaxis's work. I love those too. I love Xenonauts. I'm super stoked for Xenonauts 2. and whatever else Firaxis is working on. You got Golden Hawk doing Xenonauts, and you got Firaxis with the new XCOM.
And do you know about Phoenix Point being developed by Julian Gollop?
Julian Gollop, yeah. I was day one. I was looking at that Kickstarter. It'll be interesting. I'm very happy about the kind of renaissance of tactical combat games. Although, I hope there's room for a Brigador Tactics game somewhere down the line. It's not what we're working on now. I can't. As much as I would love to do that, the like super systems heavy stuff I'm kind of burned out on. So we're trying some little different stuff for now. So we want to make something that kind of stood on its own from a systemic gameplay standpoint. And the games that we were looking at, Crusader No Remorse was a huge touchstone, and the original Syndicate as well.
Oh yes.
So those two were huge. And then from a broader context, there were games like XCOM. A big frustration that I personally have with games is when a game has mechanics, has aspects of itself that don't intermesh. Our goal is to we always want to make games where every aspect of the game can feed in on something. And we did an okay job of that with Brigador. The idea being that, you deploy, you make money during the deployment, and then you, out of deployment, spend that money to unlock new things. And that was only in the freelance mode, and that was as the game was originally conceived. And since the campaign was kind of tacked on at the end, that's why there's that separation there. It's a bit of a disconnect. And that also is the source of a lot of confusion. But it's one of the reasons why I love XCOM so much, is that tactical combat gives you resources or a deficit that you then are in the geoscape, base management to deal with that, doing resource management, allocating research, all this stuff. And then you have the geoscape where you are deciding what to intercept, what tactical engagements to actually engage in, based on your capabilities as a group of soldiers, and that all feeds back into itself, and it's this harmonious flow. And I love that, and that's Battle Brothers is probably my game of the year. I've known those guys met them on TIG stores back in like 2014 or 2015. Super early days for both Brigador and Battle Brothers, and we just started chatting, and we went through Greenlight together. We went through early access together. We were always within 6 months of each other on every major milestone. Although we would swap each time. So like we went through Greenlight first, they went through early access first, we launched first, and each time we would have these long communications about like, okay, well, what'd you do right, what'd you do wrong, how can we do this better? And I mean, those guys are great, Jan and the whole crew. So.
Oh, yeah. I spoke with Jan last year too, just like right around the time Battle Brothers was released. And yeah, that was a lot of fun. And if we start talking more about XCOM and Battle Brothers, we'll be here all night long, very easily. Because those are some of my favorite games as well.
Yeah, and Twanger, I would love nothing more than a Brigador Battle Brothers crossover. I'm writing them an email later today to chat about, just kind of catch up, but some related stuff. And if you guys like those games, like Battle Brothers, we've been talking with the Star Sector guys a lot. Alexander and I'm blanking on the other guy's name, but they're also just really good guys. And Star Sector is an awesome game. So it's nice to have a community of game developers where like we're making different games, but it feels like we're all making games that each other could conceivably want to make. So it's like having other versions of me making games that I want to play anyway. So it's a wonderful kind of. I'm glad they're making the games they're making, and I'm glad they're making them well, because that means I don't have to.
And you should get in touch with Red Hook too, and just get them involved too. We'll have a Battle Brother Brigador in the Darkest Dungeon.
So that's actually it's funny you mentioned Red Hook because I met up with them mainly. I'm gonna botch his name, but Barasa.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he did the art for it. I met him at GDC several years ago at kind of an after hours event, and I talked his ear off. And this is back in like 2014, I think, and he's been a lovely fellow for a long time.
Oh, yeah. We've spoken several times on the podcast too. Great guy.
Awesome, yeah. I mean, it's a fun. We got a fun community around here, so it's nice.
Let me do a quick time check. All right. I guess we'll get to Mike's question and then we'll move on to talk a little bit more about Up Armor. I think that will probably be our final topic for the evening because I think we could easily, again, when it comes to game design and talking about, we can be here 3-4 hours. That's a light chat between us. But I might want to ask you, what are your thoughts on Steam Direct? Especially, I guess, considering the fact that Steam Direct obviously happened after you guys went through the whole early access period.
Yeah. Kind of have to be careful here. So we're already on the other side of that, right? If we were pre-green light right now, I would probably have a very different answer because, I have the comfort of being able to say that, Brigador is a game that it got through green light in a few days, went through very fast, and we were fortunate to have the means and the time to build a game of sufficient scale and complexity. And my brother is a good artist that it had that kind of immediate and apparent value. And so we had no issues with gatekeeping or anything, at least on that initial stage. We faltered on that on a promotional side, but with Steam Direct, that's a case where it's just like it just depends on part of it's just the industry is evolving. And also just what the expectations are with the platform. Valve have been moving for a long time towards automation of as many systems as possible, especially given the massive scope of their user base and of the number of games being published on that platform. And I think a lot of the friction that's happening right now is because Steam started as a curated platform and it's moving towards, and it basically is already now moved into an open platform. It would be fine if it started as an open platform and then is now an open platform. But that shift is what's causing a lot of the friction, I think, because that is also changing expectations. And from a developer standpoint, there's a degree of frustration because as someone who has made a game that would have made it onto Steam in 2012, that used to be a golden ticket.
Yeah. Because
on a curated platform with that large of a user base, but that limited an array of possible titles, we probably would have done much better. Conversely, if we didn't have the means to make Brigador at the scope that we did, I would be extraordinarily frustrated to be denied essentially the only really viable broad-based platform, to be denied access to that just purely because either someone can't see the value in the game or we lack the resources to achieve that. So I think in the long run it is healthy for Steam Direct to happen. I think it's a better implementation than the kind of weird mob voting that Greenlight was.
It's not.
because it's stimulating that independent community, but at the same time, itch.io is also doing that now, and itch.io is growing, and there is the kind of we've broken the barrier, I think, insofar as the number of games being released each year has been growing asymptotically, and it's going to taper off at some point, but there are new and unique challenges now to developing games. Like distributing it used to be half the battle, and now it's trivial. Like you can get on Steam trivially, and Steam is fantastic for distribution. GOG is probably the hardest to get onto, but like itch.io is great, and itch.io and Humble both allow you to have independent widgets that you sell, essentially automating the back end. So if you want to use Humble or Itch to sell your game, you can just do that and only market it from a direct sale point on your website, and that way you're receiving a much higher revenue split. And it essentially removes the hassle of managing the back end, because managing credit card payments and all that stuff, it's tremendously risky if you don't know what you're doing, and it's horribly complicated, or at least intimidating. So distribution is no longer the battle. The battle now is focusing along just being seen at all. It's rather than like trying to get into a club that's sparsely populated and has a very severe, a very limited guest list. Now it's okay, cool. You're in this giant stadium that's full of people. How do you be the dude who's in the nosebleed section that someone sees? It's like, this is the game that I want.
Yeah,
it's a wholly different paradigm, essentially. And like I don't have any answers for that yet, because I'm still figuring it out myself for our future projects. But it's not that the problem has gotten worse or gotten better. It's just that the problem is different.
Yeah. And that's the double-edged sword of having a curated versus a non-curated platform. When it's curated, the guys who are on there certainly have a great time. But then what happens when you're off the guest list? For those of you who missed the news, there was this whole big hoopla over Opus Magnum from Zachtronics not getting onto GOG. And again, like, people are getting angry and annoyed at GOG, but in the same breath, it's their platform. They're curating it. But then, of course, we can talk about something like, as we said, with Steam, where now it's you basically slip the bouncer $100 and you're now in the club. But now, how do you get noticed when everybody is in there?
Everyone's slipping. Yes. Everyone's greasing the palms. Yeah, and I don't have a good answer for that. We've had a few lucky at bats. Mainly just for me running my mouth on the internet, some Integer posts and some other things. But it's probably good that I work for myself now, given that if you Google me and Google like Hugh Monahan Brigador, it's an increasingly colorful array that's presented. I don't know. I think it is the question now for people who are either working on games or in the process of releasing games now, and if you're not focusing on that to some extent, then you're going to be in trouble, unless you have a massive pre-existing audience.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, like, I think part of that is just understanding who you are catering to. I think as we're kind of ballooning out the number of games coming out, I think it's going to increasingly behoove people to do more specialized type games for a more limited audience. So where you can, the way you get known, making a 3D shooter, that's going to be hard as balls to get recognized as a 3D shooter in the current environment. Yeah. Whereas if you make something that's hyper niche, yes, you are limiting your possible audience, but it means that anyone interested in that topic, rather than having to find you amidst a sea of 10,000 other games,
Mm-hmm.
they're having to find you amidst a sea of three.
Yeah.
And then you don't even have to do anything in that regard, so long as people know you exist. Like, so long as you're simply on that playing field and are discoverable, you just need to be in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like, oh, okay, well, there's this feudal management, like feudal children having sim game. And then there's this one, and there's this, like, okay, well, what are the pros and cons of each? And there's going to be community conversation about that. But you've already kind of brought yourself to the table.
Yeah.
So I don't know. But
Yeah. I know.
I'm kind of ruminating at this point.
Yeah, it's very similar to what I do like here with the Game Wisdom YouTube channel and of course Game Wisdom, that I know I'm not going to be beating Kotaku or IGN anytime soon. But what I offer is something very different with the discussions on game design, talking to developers like yourself. So if someone wants to learn more about game design or hear game developers talk, I'm one of the very few voices on the internet that actually do that. So it allows me to stand out that much more rather than me trying to, I guess, in a manner of speaking, punch up and try to go after these major sites. Now, we got a bunch of questions. El Gordo is trying to ruin the whole schedule again by taking us into Up Armor before we get there. He is sabotaging me there, but we will get to those Oscar's questions in a few minutes. But to jump around some of the other questions that we got, and then again, we will get to Up Armor. We will get to the fireworks factory at some point, folks. But Ian Goldberg's asking, will we ever see a Brigador RTS?
So Brigador originally was an RTS. So it's in the DNA. I would love to do something along the lines of like a ground control or a world in conflict. But it's not going to be in the next iteration of games that come out. So what we're working on right now is not an RTS, so I can confidently say that. But that is something, RTS and tactical, that realm is something I'm still extraordinarily interested in. And so who knows? What I can authoritatively say is that we plan on the next several projects all being within a like continuity of a Brigador universe. And so it's just we're fortunate in that we built something that we like enough that we just want to keep working within it. And I think that's one of the ways that we're trying to differentiate ourselves from other game developers, is that we're going to be making games, some of which are wildly different from our current oeuvre, but they are all going to share this connective DNA, both from just being this whatever weird shit we come up with, because from our team, but also that thematically they're all going to be delving into different aspects of this world that we've created.
Cool. Let's see. I think I know the answer to this question from Sergey, but he was asking regarding localizing to other languages. Is it expensive? I would assume for a game like Brigador with the amount of text, that's probably a little bit more on the complicated side.
I mean, ballpark, it's been costing us somewhere in the $2,000 to $4,000 per language. Some are more expensive than others, and some of them we're having to go back and do some fix-ups because there's some. Brigador is a very challenging game to localize because we committed kind of several sins or complications. One is that it's a lot of the text, especially anything weapons or vehicle related, is very technically oriented. So you're getting a lot of technical, military, and scientific jargon. So that's a huge pain in the ass for people to localize.
Yeah.
We use a lot of idiomatic language, and we have a lot of either song titles or song lyrics that we use for titles. Um, that's a huge issue. The name Brigador is a relatively obscure Portuguese word for like bully or fighter, and doesn't necessarily transliterate well. So in some cases, we've just kept it as a phonetic, Brigador. In other languages, like actually in English, like it doesn't mean anything in English. And we're kind of actually we're trying to appropriate the word as something that is just purely associated with us, even though the flavor context of the original Portuguese word kind of is consonant with the world that we're building. Um, but like in Chinese, we're working on the Chinese localization right now, and we could have done the phonetic translation, but it's just sort of a nonsense word. We ended up choosing a word in Chinese that roughly means troublemakers, and it gives it kind of a different flair, but it's a fun like it, and that's where it's just finding localizers that you trust and are. It requires a lot of just back and forth. Is the answer? You just have to you can't just hand over a script of everything and just be one and done with it. You have to answer a lot of questions and provide as much context as you can.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and I mean, the bright side of it though is that for the most, like localizing as a whole, some of the languages that we've done haven't paid for themselves yet, but taken in aggregate, localizing has made us money. So that's something I'm very happy about and something we're going to keep doing, and trying to support a more international audience, especially since there's a lot of Portuguese and Brazilian history that we leverage in order to build Brigador, and to kind of provide an element of context. And so it was when we were looking at what languages we wanted to localize to, even though Portuguese isn't the kind of top earner, we wanted to make sure we did it just sort of out of deference and respect for the source material, I guess.
Let's see. Oh, here's a good question from Ian. He also asked regarding the music, was that 80s synthwave, was that like your original plan for Brigador, or did you have other styles in mind as well?
So the very first trailer for Brigador, Brigador. So if you search the Brigador reveal trailer, the theme for that was actually done by my brother Jack. It wasn't Makeup and Vanity Set. It's one of two tracks from the soundtrack that we actually did internally. My brother's a very multi-talented person, and he was capable enough to kind of get to like the core of what we wanted. And from there, we had this kind of litmus test for going to other artists, and it's like, can you do something like this? And of course, when we finally found Makeup and Vanity Set and played him this track, he was just like, oh, all right. And then the rest is history, and he blew us out of the water. And what's been great about that is he's such a phenomenal artist to work with, because for the uparmored edition, we did another album of music, but he only contributed a couple of tracks. It's 9 total tracks, 3 of which are by Vanity Set, and then 6 of which are by guest artists who all did different tracks. We got Pilot Priest, Oxide, I'm blanking on some of the other guys, but they're all great musicians, and it's wonderful because the album as a whole, it feels like a contiguous thing, and so Vanity Set, Matt basically produced it, and kind of decided that, and like he was the one who did a lot of the reaching out for it, but that was such a good experience for us. That's something we want to keep doing, and it's nice to be able to still work with him, but also to reach out to other musicians and to kind of broaden the flavor of what Brigador can be. And so I'm interested in branching out in some of the style. We're going to keep working with Vanity Set as long as we can. I mean, he's a joy to work with, and I love that music. So we're already talking with him about doing stuff for future projects. But yeah, and let me just like run through these real quick. Kickstarter for a lore book. Let's just say it's something that I've been looking into very seriously, and I've made some, may have visited the Kickstarter main office, but it's not going to be anytime soon. And yes, next project is going to be Brigador Universe. I don't know if you were here when I was talking about that earlier. Russian localization is difficult. Something from SA, would you say that various communities have been helpful with finding buzz? Something Awful has been great. Something Awful, so we have a couple of forums. Something Awful was a little slow to take off at first, but then once it really hit, I mean, our Something Awful thread has 179 pages on it right now, and I can't tell you how powerful it is to have a community to kind of rallies around you, and even if it's just shit posting, that's still just a great guys doing memes of your game or of characters and stuff. It turns a project that you're working on from this sort of inert thing, like this inert sculpture that you're working on, to a dynamic living thing, and that's one of the reasons we were able to work on it as long as we have. I mean, with this next update in the next few months, when we're finally fully closing the book on Brigador, it will have basically been 7 years of work on a single project. And I never want to do that again. I hope to be good enough that I can achieve, same level of quality or better, and same volume, but hopefully in a much shorter time frame. But no, the feedback has been a tremendous help. And we made some major changes to the gameplay. Like, one of the biggest ones was the audio kinetic impulse. It's a weapon ability that it's basically a sound shotgun. And originally it was an AoE effect around the player, and it only damaged the environment. It didn't really damage vehicles, but it stunned vehicles. And it was cool, but it also kind of sucked. And there are people who it was so close to being a good ability, but it just wasn't as fun to use as it should have been. And it was based on that feedback, and the feedback from the community, where it was like, we love this, but it sucks. Make it better. And so that was what forced me to. I went back to it a couple times, and the final one, it's probably the favorite, one of the favorite weapons in the game. And I was very proud of the flavor text for it as well. I wrote that one. I had a lot of fun writing it. Yeah, I mean, the community is huge in anything, but it's especially been for us. And yeah, and make him advantage that he's so prodigious. And he's such a prolific musician. I swear the guy's coming out with a new album every 3 months. But anyway, all right. I think I'm caught up now.
All right. There's one other question then for me, and then we'll move on to our final topic. I know we've been saying it for the last hour and a half.
Yeah, that's fine.
Going back to what you were saying earlier regarding the work that you did to making Brigador's engine, it's basically a custom engine you guys put together yourself. Do you see yourselves using that for whatever future projects you're going to work on within the Brigador universe, or do you think going forward you may use a pre-made engine?
So one of the next projects we're doing, is Brigador engine, but that will be it. That so um, reusing the Brigador engine is allowing us to have a much faster cycle time.
Yeah.
But then after that, we'll be moving to Unreal.
Okay. Gotcha. All right. I think with that, we're going to move on. Oh, that's another real question by Oscar. Will it be viable to implement fan localizations?
Uh,
Well, I think
Theoretically, yeah.
Okay.
So the concern there is basically we don't, and I realize for people who have, uh, we probably could have done with better editing on a few of the languages so far, but um, the issue with fan localization is just that we want to pay people for their work, and that kind of soliciting for like, oh, if you do it, we'll put it in, but also we're not going to pay you. That makes me deeply uncomfortable. And one of the guys who works on the game, his name is Benjamin Glover. He's I'd be kind of drowning in my own inability to schedule things if he weren't around. He's been functioning as kind of like a contracted producer, and he's also been running all the localizations and kind of handling that end of things. But he, having worked in localizations himself, he's very careful to make sure that we're not exploiting people for their work. And so that's this kind of tricky chicken and the egg thing, because ideally we would love to have Brigador in all languages, but part of that is making sure that if we're going to do it, we want to pay people, but at the same time, you have to be careful about it not being a money losing. That's where Brigador has done okay for us, but it's not done well enough that I can just kind of throw money around. And also, there are additional costs because I don't, and that's not to say that fan translations are inherently bad, but you want to work with people and then have a degree of quality control to make sure that it's up to snuff. And to that end, we're hiring editors to go over a few of the languages that do have problems, because there's some mistranslations and other things, and because we want to make sure that, especially since we're continuing to do stuff in the Brigador universe, that we have a through line continuity across this, and to avoid and it's a difficult, complicated problem, but the short version is it's not a hard no. It's just, if we're going to do a language, we want to pay the person for it and do it properly, which takes time and effort. And then on our side, on the programming side, we have to do implementation, and especially because right now we're working on Chinese, which means not only is it doing a localization, but also adding the characters and the ability to even put that language into the game. So that's a lot of programming time and everything else. There's always hidden costs to any of these things. But
definitely. All right. Let me do a quick time check. We're just about an hour and 40 in. And again, as you said earlier, Hugh, we can talk a lot about game design, and oh my goodness, we could probably be here all night long. I think, you're an hour behind me, I think, in terms of time. So
I'm in Central Time, so it's just 5 minutes off 5 right now.
And it's just about 6 my time. So I think with that, we're going to move on to our final set of questions. Hopefully, we'll see what happens. And this will be focusing more on the uparmored edition. So I think that will probably be, they'll include Sergey's question there as well. But we've already kind of been talking in and out about uparmored over the length of this cast. But to kind of frame things here, as we've said, following the release of Brigador in 2016, let's see, that's 22 factions. Electric Twanger's asking, can you fight 2 factions on one map so the player can take advantage of infighting?
Okay, so real quick, Sergey, we haven't added new freelance missions, but with every major update, we've added new story missions. With Up Armored, we added 12 new ones that we redid the tutorial as 12 kind of broader set missions, and then added another set of 4. That was a primer. So like Fly Blackbird, which is now the mission number 4, was originally the first mission, and it only had 3 tutorial missions before it. By the time we got to Up Armored Edition, there were 12 tutorial missions and 3 kind of primer full missions leading into Flyback Blackbird. So we added 15 new ones. And then the E and I think D&D set missions also came afterwards. So we've added new missions, and we're bumping up right against the memory limitations. We could technically just expand the requirement to be like 2.5 gigs, but we're not going to do that just because we have a lot of players who are like barely running the game, and if we were to expand that, we would essentially lock them out of a game that they've owned and been able to play for a while. So I have tentatively planned one more set of missions to go in. But that is predicated on basically me defragging the game. Like, I have to figure out where I can cut out some memory without actually removing anything from the game in order to make space for those final maps. And, there's a couple more pilots and maps that I want to put in that I haven't been able to and also because I'm on top of all of this, I'm handling like administrative elements and everything else. So, yeah. And then just real quick, okay, 2 factions fighting. So that we actually had that working at one point, and it could theoretically work again, but essentially we had to opt against it. It was a decision between, do we want would you rather have a shitload of enemies on screen at the same time, or have a much lower cap of total possible enemies, but be able to have multiple factions? It all boils down to how we handle vision in the game, and it's a little more complicated for us because it's not, simpler games can just do like a single line of sight. Like Hotline Miami, you're only doing 2 axes for the vector, X and Y, and it's just, raycast, can they see or not? Okay, go. With Brigador, we're dealing with 3. We're dealing with 3 space. So, we raycast from a point. Technically, a vehicle sees from 3/4 its height, and then we raycast to 3/4 the height of the player vehicle. And if it can see that across the height of objects, then the player is spotted. But we also have to deal with sound propagation and aggro calls. So, for example, so it basically just boils down to processing time, but also the gameplay complexity. Because, right now, for example, if you blow up a pipeline, explosive pipeline, that's going to aggro enemy units within hearing range. Now, if there are multiple different factions, you have to deal with target prioritization. You have to deal, and you could do that simply with just like shoot the dude who is closest to you. But, we spent a lot of time iterating on movement and how enemies like engage you and all these other things. And if you had multiple factions in addition to the player, on the one hand, you don't want to make it so that everyone immediately stops and turns and shoots at you, but you also don't want to make it so that you just get ignored completely. And that's where you do things like threat zones, and we were already so strapped for just finishing the damn game in the first place that we realized that uh, not allowing interfaction fighting would just give us it would simplify some of the design burden and also increase performance on overall. So it was just, I would love to do that, and maybe we will on a future project, but just for what we had on hand, we just had to cut it. Seth, hey, thanks for coming. Do you view Spacer Society as the result of overwhelming abundance, destroying the need for cooperative social norms, or the isolating and detached environment of space? Ooh, that is spicy. I should actually get Carl in here because he wrote most of the Spacers, so I'm gonna try and channel him as much as I can. I'm actually gonna copy and paste this to him. So my soft answer is going to be that I view Spacers as kind of a manifestation of, I guess, hedonism without repercussion, in that when you have people don't a lot of times people won't do bad things. It's a whole like Ring of Gyges problem, right? So a lot of people don't do bad things not because they're bad, but because bad things will happen to them if they get caught. Mm-hmm. So it becomes like it's not doing something because you're behaving morally, but because doing a quote bad thing is actually bad for you, or like you can't. There's the fear of repercussions, or not getting away with it, or violating social norms, et cetera, et cetera. When with the Spacers, you have this confluence of abundance and a society that is not only permissive towards excess, but in fact encourages and indulges in it. Now, as to like the specific evolution of that, I think that's just what happens when you have people being sufficiently rich for a long enough period of time. One of the greatest compliments we ever got was from a player of Brigador who he was just in our chat channel, and our chat channel on one of the forums, but what he posted was he was working as a server at a private house event. So it was like a political fundraiser or something. So he was he's like serving hors d'oeuvres to a bunch of rich people on like a manor house. Might have been in the DC area or something, but he just said, all I can think about is that I'm at a party with a bunch of Spacers. And it was just like, holy shit. Like that's one of the greatest compliments we've ever gotten. Yeah, I don't know. Part of the joy of making your own universe like this, and so for you guys, Seth has written his own book and is working on the second one. So go ahead and feel free to pimp that one here, Seth. But I think part of the joy of creating a universe and leaving enough room for interpretation is that people can lens that and come to understand it in ways that are meaningful to them. And that's I'm really happy that amidst our player base we have a pretty good split between like what people self-identify as, like, because there's a lot of people who actually like Spacers are their boys, like that's how they see themselves, and they in some cases it's a wish fulfillment, like being free of the bonds of finances or of kind of social mores. Whereas, conversely, it's taking more of the Bushido code, like kind of the samurai elements, the warrior, that kind of element of Spacer Society, and that's more what they identify with, and you can kind of morph or kind of pick and pull from these factions to kind of suit you. And we've got several people who've done cosplays of Corvids. And it's awesome because they're like, okay, well, what does a corvid look like? And our response is like, just put on the teal and find some, homebrew that shit, man. Like that's the whole joy of the corvids, is that kind of bootstrap, just pick up whatever you can, and it's resulted in some really awesome and very authentic looking cosplays, and I love that aspect of it. Anyway, I hope that answered your question, Seth. Let me just run through real quick. Mike, advice to people wanting to get into game dev now, is it worthwhile? I have the feeling, my sentiment is that it's going to suck for the next couple of years. I think if you're starting out now, I think if you're getting ready to sell your game in the next couple of years, it's going to suck. I think if you're starting now, in a few more years, I may be wrong. This is purely me shooting from the hip, but I have the feeling that there's going to be a big kill off in the next few years, because you're getting this asymptotic growth in people going into game dev, and the foundations are shifting, and so a lot of what was reliable either for funding or for revenue, that's changing, and the people who aren't adapting are going to fall by the wayside. But if you're starting out now, maybe you are able to find your niche without, you're not having to adapt, because you're already building within this new, this changing environment. What I will say, though, is, and this isn't even exclusive just to video games, with any entrepreneurial occupation, right? If you're going that route, your job basically is to give yourself a long enough runway that you can survive your inevitable fuck-ups. Because the question isn't, are you gonna mess up? The question is, how many times are you gonna do it, and how long is it going to take you to recover from that before you're self-sustaining? And I hope it doesn't. If you do start up with going indie, I hope it doesn't take you the 5 to 6 years it took us to ship a game, because we barely survived that. And I have Imager posts attesting to the horrific tolls that took. But the other thing I would just say is, if you want to make video games, don't wait for someone to give you permission, or to wait for some threshold to where I now have a sufficient knowledge base to do this. Because at the end of the day, it's something I really appreciate about game development right now, is because it's so mutable, and it's still this kind of Wild West. It's very much this sort of punk rock ethos where, look, if you want to start a band, the first step is to start a band, and then, all right, pick your instrument. And if you're going to be a guitarist in your punk band, well, start learning to play the guitar. But start that band and start playing. Don't read a book about how to play the guitar. I mean, you can do that, and that might be helpful, but if you're doing that, you should be doing it while you're also playing guitar. And the same thing with game dev. It's like, I've read plenty of books about game design, and it's good to take an academic approach to things, but don't do that to the exclusion of actually doing the thing. If you want to make games, start making games, and then read what you can, and there's myriad opportunities. There's all the GDC archives. They have a bunch of free hour-long videos by some of the best people in the world in games design, or programming or whatever, giving these great talks. So the resources are there. Just make sure that if you're going to commit to it, either you have something to support you while you're adapting to this new career, or that you've built in for yourself a long enough runway, and then you can afford failure.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, kind of a roundabout way of answering that question.
Oh goodness, yeah, it's definitely a fascinating topic, especially as you said, Hugh, regarding being sustainable in the game industry. For the fans of Game Wisdom, we just spoke with Jake Burgett of Gray Alien Games, who's been doing this for now, I think he's going on about 2 decades at this point, maybe a little bit more, and it is such a different experience making games for yourself versus making games that can be sustainable for a company, and it's just its own very interesting quagmire. And my goodness, we are at 2 hours in. I do like to say, I love how the cast segue into a philosophical debate about life and morality. We had, when we talked with Cliff Harris, we segue into a grammar lesson. So it's always great when we get like a little random topic right in the middle. But like I said, we are at 2 hours in. We're just over 2 hours in. I want to ask you, who?
Yeah, now all you blokes show up. Jeez.
Yeah, now everybody shows up right at the 2 hour mark to throw in some questions. But I want to ask you, do you still feel like, are you still able to like chat? Do you have to get going in a few minutes? Like, what do you think?
Getting close to it, but it's not a hard mark. So I want to be a completionist here. So let's get through everything.
All right. Do you think you can answer Ian's question there really quickly, or is that going to be a long one?
Precursor James, it is his face.
Mhm.
I can say that canonically, and I will say nothing else.
All right.
But he does. Precursor James does exist in some form. He's not an imaginary thing. But that's all we say about Precursor Jimmy.
Reminds me of when I asked Paul Ritchie and Fred Ford about the character in Star Control 2 with the why the screen turns purple when he's talking to Trader, and like, there's an answer that we just don't want to tell you. Like, we're not telling you that answer. Just
oh my gosh, Star Control 2. I mean, those games, that was such a seminal experience for me. I love that you were able to talk to them, because that, gosh, I owe so much to both of them. Like Star Control, Horde, yeah. Anyway, that's a whole other conversation for a different time.
Yeah. And yeah, I'm saying when the stream started, there was a light outside Hugh's window. Now it's dark out. If we're not careful, light will come back to that window. Yes. We just keep going.
I've been on this. Yeah, seen that happen before. Okay, so from your standpoint, Josh, is there anything else that you wanted to ask specifically on like Brigador or uparmored or anything else?
Yeah, I did have
we have a moment.
Yeah, I did have a few questions I wanted to bring up. Again, for those of you watching this recorded or live, if you don't know what we're talking about, the uparmored edition is, of course, the second launch of Brigador. That, again, you guys said that was June of 2017, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, so just real quick, what we basically did was we added localization for 6 new languages. Originally, it was English only. We added localization. We completely redid the tutorials. We did some rebalancing, added new vehicles, added new levels, and did a new album of music.
Okay. And as you said, it was all about, of course, changing or giving the option for a new control scheme as well.
That was the biggest thing. Was we added that control scheme actually pretty soon in. That was only a few months after the original 1.0 launch. We added that in. Mm-hmm. The difference was that no one goes to the settings menu. Just that's not something people do. So that's what I was saying earlier about having something be opt-in as opposed to opt-out. Mm-hmm. The biggest change, I think, from a sales and kind of functional standpoint, was we changed the default control scheme to be the simpler twin stick style. And then if you're the type of person who goes into the settings menu, you're also the type of person who's probably going to be more interested in having tank controls. And then they will see that, and then they would try the different control schemes. And then, okay. And that was how we kind of, people self-selected into that category rather than selected out. And that made such a huge difference.
Yeah, and I want to just elaborate more on that. I think that's a very big point in terms of player psychology, where whatever you put as the quote-unquote default experience, that's what they're going to assume is what they're supposed to be playing as. As you just said, Hugh, most people aren't going to be digging into settings menus to, find somewhere in there a different control scheme. And it's very important. I'm sure you can probably test this as well. It's very important to present that first experience to be as easy and as accommodating as possible, because it can be such a huge point for someone brand new trying to play your game.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there. It's just what if if the average player isn't able to immediately get into your game,
Mm-hmm.
then you're in trouble. So the question is more not, uh, you know, it's not like is the game too hard or too easy. It's more look at who your average player
Mm-hmm.
is intended to be, because if you're making a game that is explicitly for super hardcore people, and Brigador could have been that. It
Yeah.
still kind of is, and we have a lot of really hardcore fans, and I love that. But part of it just the financial necessity of the fact that we took so damn long building the thing that we had to make sure that it was more broadly accessible, and that's why we changed a lot of the things that we did in order to make it so that we could appeal to a broader audience, and we were able to actually recoup the investment on making the game. But that was a near thing for us to make that happen. But there's a lot of guys who make very good livings and are able to uh, cater to a very niche audience by just understanding, what that very niche audience wants, and kind of a rule of thumb is the more niche of an audience you're catering to, the more valuable what you make is to them, and subsequently, and it's not that you're trying to uh, you know be a plunger and just like pull as much money out of an audience as possible, but like if you're doing a super niche thing, you should probably be selling it for 30, 40, or $50, because the by virtue of making something that like you're making this thing that no one else is making, you're able to actually provide this unique service, and that sets you apart from other people, and you need to be able to compensate. You shouldn't build a $20 million budget game for 20 people. That's that's losing your skill, unless those 20 people are billionaires, right? So you have to understand who you're catering to and who your audience is. But anyway, sorry, I kind of fell off on that question. But last question for me: what games do you play on your downtime? You prefer to step away from if you're not working? So I was talking about this earlier, but I have almost 400 hours in Battle Brothers. I've been playing that since day one on early access. It's a regular for me. I have I have simultaneous different campaigns running at the same time, depending upon my mood and level of inebriation. But I've been playing a lot of PUBG lately. That's my like when I need to exercise that kind of red-blooded aspect, get my murder on. Otherwise, a friend of mine just bought me Divinity 2 because he wants to ruin my life. I'm saving the end of Pillars of Eternity for when Pillars of Eternity 2 comes out. Like I've got about 100 hours in Pillars, and I've got like that final section ready to go, but I'm intentionally not playing it until 2 is done, and then I can just do this like smooth transition from one into the other. I'm trying to think of what else I've been playing lately. I've been making a concerted effort to kind of get around to games that I've been interested in for a long time, but never actually got around to playing. So I'm just pulling up my library right now. Like I just started getting into Cryptarch, because that's one that's been thrown around a lot on our forum, and I'm a fan of Alien Trap. They're good guys. this next week, I'm planning on finally digging into Signal from Tolva.
Hmm.
And what else? I was playing some Bomber Crew earlier. And since I'm a judge for some of the IGF stuff, I've already got a good 15 hours into the Breach, and I can attest that it is a very enjoyable game. So yeah, I don't know. I'm skipping around a bunch of different stuff, but yeah, the bulk of what I play is right now is probably PUBG and Battle Brothers.
All right. Um, Let me check here. Yeah, I have a bunch of questions for you, but I know we are getting late. So, again,
Let's just do like a rapid fire round.
yeah.
Let's just. I'll try to give as pithy an answer as possible, and then we'll close it up.
And if you're free again in the future, we can always have you back on for another live chat.
Yeah,
we have
it's always a pleasure.
We have more questions than I thought we would get from chat. Only like 4 or 5 people would show up, and we got almost an entire crew here. So thank you guys for coming out and keeping us busy tonight and keeping Hugh into like the wee hours of the night, as you can see by his window in the background. But I guess the big question that I want to ask you about Uparmored, and I know Oscar asked one earlier that I'll scroll back up, see if we can find it. But the one thing I want to ask you, and this is why I asked when I spoke with Skyshine's Bedlam's developer, was after the launch of Brigador, and then your decision to work on Uparmored Edition and doing the changes, and again having sort of a pseudo second launch. How did you go into things from a design perspective, saying, here's where our game was at 1.0, what should we do or what should we focus on to make it this new version?
That's a good question. The short answer is that so like after the original launch, a lot of the posting I was doing and kind of public communication, I gave several talks on the failures of Brigador, was almost like my own process of mourning, in that, my instinct was to lash out, and that, the impulse is, whenever something goes wrong, the human impulse is to blame everyone around you, be like, ask who fucked me. But I should hope I don't think I indulged in that too much, and part of all the posting and writing and talks that I was giving was a process of me trying to understand what happened and to position myself such that I could prevent that from happening again, and also understand if there's anything I could do about it. But the way I figured it out, well, part of it was just I realized I'm a stubborn enough person that if we just dropped Brigador where it was at 1.0, that would eat at me for the rest of my life, because I was deeply unhappy with how things had gone, and even though I was proud of what we made, it was like this isn't what it's supposed to be yet. And after a few months of downtime and of just kind of mental and physical, beginning the process of mental and physical recovery, we communally came to the decision of, okay, let's fix this. And part that was largely informed by the feedback we were getting, was because even before we even launched, that's one of the challenges of just like you just have to have experience, because the evidence was there. I mean, we had big name streamers come up to our booth, start playing the game, and of course get annihilated, and then they kind of get flushed a little bit and be like, fuck this game, and then walk away. And I'm very thankful to Ezekiel III, who he played Brigador on stream for like 2.5 hours. And it was back when the difficulty scaling was like way too high. And it was like 2.5 hours of pulling teeth, but he was a wonderful sport about it. And like me, in the meantime, I'm in the chat being this like pedantic asshole, like, you're doing it wrong. I like trying to encourage him, but in reality, it probably just was terrible. And it was so keenly obvious if I knew to look that the game was too hard, and like we had the we had the breadth on the high end of difficulty, but we needed to bring the low end down, bring that floor down to the point where it was more approachable to a typical player level. And that we could do that without compromising the fundamental essence of the game. And that's where, you know, I had enough foresight to design the game around this sort of modular idea of difficulty of, you know, some vehicles are explicitly better than others, some pilots make the game explicitly harder, and within that set you kind of pick what, you know, what the experience you want is. The mistake I made was that I didn't make the minimum difficulty low enough, and between that and the dissonance on the control scheme, and just it was almost unanimous frustration with both of those elements. It's like, okay, well, let's just address these things. And so we spent several months doing a new tutorial. We changed the default control scheme, and for extra momentum, we were doing the localizations. I mean, we basically doubled down on the game because because we spent another, I mean, it was a year of time, but it was more like 8 months of full-time work. But that reinvestment basically was, if that didn't work out, like, we're done. Like, it's game over. I quit, and you know, I thankfully I'm already in a position where like I can get a job at a AAA studio as a designer now, and that's a nice kind of backup to have. I hope I never have to indulge in that unless I want to, but you know, it was a dark period, and I think it's some combination of very hard work and good fortune, and some people who reached out and were very generous with both their time and resources to kind of help us make it happen. So, yeah, it was a whole bunch of different things, but basically we had those two kind of glaring friction points, and so we just started by addressing those. And it took a long time to do it properly, but when we did, that made a big difference.
Great. All right. I hate to cut things, I guess, short in a metaphorical speaking, but I know we are way past our time, and I actually do have to get going in a few minutes myself. So I'm afraid this would normally be the time where I would ask the chat for any final questions, but I'm afraid if we do that, we'll be here.
And we've already hit those.
Yeah.
Just real quick with Flavian, loyalists. Left authoritarian loyalists, left libertarian Corvids, right authoritarian spacers, right libertarianists, and C center right. I'm hesitant to give any of that kind of explicit labeling, and I don't see it as that same kind of kind of stratified political lines. It's more, I see it more along cultural lines. So I pinged the other developers about the spacer question, and Carl's response. Carl's one who largely, you know, where my brother Jack came up with spacers, kind of that zygote of what they would be, but Carl did a lot to flesh them out and kind of made them his own. But he said that from, you know, the original question of, do you view space society as the result of overwhelming abundance, destroying the need for cooperative social norms, or B, the isolating detachment and detached environment of space? And he responded with, it's more like an entire class of people is entirely separated from those who support them, and so they stop thinking that A, they're also people, and B, that they should be held to the same standards. So it's like if astronauts somehow decided that they didn't really need mission control, and that, like, and take that and then multiply that effect over many generations, and suddenly you kind of morph into your own thing. So yeah. Ooh, okay. And real quick, Ian, favorite Brigador track is Edwina's theme. Edwina is one of my favorites. She's not in the game because she's not a Brigador. She's a proper loyalist. She shows up in the book though, and actually entirely unprompted by us, Matt Pusty did a theme song for her in the not uparmored, in the let me pull it up. I'm just gonna listen to it right now. Shit. Uh, but he did it for the let's use it for the Uplink EP. But yeah, it's the third track in the Uplink EP, and it's just that perfect mix of like melancholy, but also it just he managed to write the theme song for her that synced up perfectly with what I thought of her as a character, and it like because I even though I didn't write the book, I edited a significant portion of it, and I spent a lot of time doing writing, kind of like supplementary writing specific for it. You know, she's a character that's very like deeply important to me. So yeah, that's my favorite track.
All right. And I know Oscar asked this earlier, but just getting back to Up Armored, how long did you spend on working on the Up Armored edition in terms of time?
Sorry, say the last part again.
How long did you spend working on Up Armored edition, like after the game was released?
We're still tinkering with it now, but only in a part-time. So all in told, it will have been about a year of full-time work.
Okay.
So anyway. I'm gonna keep talking if you don't cut things off. So
anyway, I hate to do it, folks. It was great having everyone on, but we do have to get going. Like I said, it's night. It's sort of out light where Hugh was at. It's already dark. We better be careful. We'll just be going till it's light and then dark again. But Hugh, it was a great pleasure having you on.
Likewise, thanks for having me.
And I guess to try endings on a happier note, in terms of sales, has the Up Armored edition helped in terms of Brigador's release?
Absolutely. It did proportionally much better, and like the month of Up Armored's launch was the best month of sales we've ever had, and it got us to the point where we have now, not necessarily at the best wages, but we have paid for the cost of developing Brigador. And so that was what got us far enough along that we could say that, hey, we can keep going. We can do another game. So Up Armored ended up saving us.
Awesome. Well, at least we ended up on a high note there.
Yeah.
But it is definitely time to go. Like I said, Hugh, if you're free in the future, we can have you back on. I'm sure these guys will show up again to grill you on all manner of questions.
Yeah. Thanks for coming, guys. And again, thanks for having me, Jeff.
Not a problem. So we're going to end things here for tonight. For the new folks, thank you so much for coming out, whether you're enjoying this live or recorded. If you're watching this recording and would like to get an ad-free version of our talk here, you can subscribe or donate to patreon.com/GWBicer to find out how. Be sure to check back here for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. My voice is dying on me as I'm going, but be sure to check out Brigador, the Up Armor edition, currently available on Steam. Is it on? I know it's on Humble Bundle. Is it on GOG as well?
Yeah, we're on Humble, Itch, GOG, and Steam.
All right. And if people want to follow you on Twitter, Hugh, would you mind giving that out?
Yeah, go for it. It's at HughSJ. So HUGHSJ on Twitter. So,
all right.
That's my main thing I use.
All right, great. And I do regular streaming most nights around 10 Eastern if you'd like to come back and hear us talk, as well as, again, the daily videos. But we are certainly past our time here, so thanks again for coming out. Again, Hugh, thank you for being on, and the best of luck with whatever your unannounced next project will be.
Thank you, and likewise with you.
Awesome. So with that said, thanks again for coming out, everybody. We're wrapping things up here. Until our next stream, have a great night.